They dragged her through the palace gates in chains made of pure silver, the one metal that could bind a Starblood. The court did not gather to mourn her. They gathered to watch. Somewhere behind a painted fan, the woman who framed her was smiling. Somewhere on the throne, the man who once swore to love her would not even meet her eyes. Seraphine Thorne, the herald announced, convicted of the attempted murder of Her Majesty Queen Dahlia, is hereby stripped of title, land, and name, and banished beyond the Veilwood, never to return upon pain of death. No one in that hall knew the truth. No one knew that 3 nights earlier, in a locked room with no windows, Seraphine had watched her own mother die, screaming the same accusation that would now be used to destroy her daughter. No one knew that sleeping in her blood, quiet for 400 years, was a power the kingdom itself had been built to fear. As the gates closed behind her and the cold forest swallowed her whole, Seraphine Thorne made herself one promise: she would return. And when she did, they would not banish her. They would kneel. The throne room of Virelle smelled of beeswax, candles, and old fear, and Seraphine had learned, in 19 years of living inside these walls, that fear always smelled sweeter when it belonged to someone else. Tonight it belonged to her. She stood on the marble dais where debutantes usually curtsied, hands bound in silver chain that burned like frostbite where it touched her wrists, and she made herself stand straight. Her father had taught her that. General Thorne, before his death at the northern border, used to say a thorn never bows before the verdict is spoken, because bowing early is the same as confessing. "Look at her," whispered Lady Vantes from the gallery, not bothering to lower her voice. "Poor thing thinks composure will save her." Seraphine did not look at Lady Vantes. She looked instead at Queen Dahlia, pale and trembling in her furs, one hand pressed to her stomach where the poison had supposedly struck 3 nights ago. The queen would not meet her eyes either. That more than anything told Seraphine everything she needed to know. The guilty rarely look away. Only the frightened do, and Dahlia was frightened of something far larger than poison. Seraphine Thorne. Duke Malric Vane rose from the council bench like a man rising to deliver good news, though his voice was carved from funeral stone. "You stand accused of slipping nightshade extract into Her Majesty's evening wine, an act witnessed by 2 members of the royal kitchen staff and corroborated by residue found in a vial hidden beneath the floorboard of your chamber." "I have never owned nightshade," Seraphine said. Her voice did not shake. She had practiced that in the mirror the night before when sleep refused to come. "I have never touched Her Majesty's wine. And any vial found beneath my floorboard was placed there by someone with a key to a room only 3 people possess: Her Majesty's steward, the head of the royal guard, and you, your grace." A ripple went through the gallery. Duke Vane's jaw tightened, just slightly, just enough that only someone trained since childhood to read the smallest movement of powerful men would catch it. Seraphine had been trained exactly that way. Her mother had made certain of it in the years before the fever that was not a fever took her. "A convenient accusation," Vane said, "from a woman with every motive to hate the crown. Your father died defending a border this council chose not to reinforce. Your mother died of illness the same week rumors began that she discovered irregularities in the treasury ledgers. And now you stand here, the last thorn, conveniently positioned beside the queen's wine cup on the one night it turned poisoned." "You say that as though grief were a crime," Seraphine answered. "I loved my parents, I do not love this council. Those are 2 very different things, and only one of them is punishable by law." Somewhere in the gallery, someone laughed, a short, surprised bark quickly smothered. Seraphine did not turn to find who. She kept her eyes on the throne, on Prince Kaelin, who had not spoken one word since the proceedings began. Kaelin. 3 months ago he had kissed her hand in the rose garden and told her that whatever storm came for House Thorne, he would stand in front of it. Tonight he sat beside his mother's throne in his ceremonial blue, and his hands were folded so tightly in his lap that his knuckles had gone white, and he said nothing at all. That silence hurt worse than the chains. "The council has reviewed the evidence," Vane continued, unrolling a scroll with theatrical slowness, "and finds the accused guilty of attempted regicide. In consideration of her father's service to the crown, the council extends mercy. Death is not required." He paused, and for one heartbeat Seraphine let herself hope. "Permanent exile beyond the Veilwood is required instead. She will surrender her name, her title, and any claim to protection under Virelle law. Should she return, the sentence becomes execution, to be carried out on sight." The word exile struck the hall like a dropped glass. Beyond the Veilwood was not simply a punishment. It was a death sentence with better manners, a forest of old magic and older monsters where no supply road ran and no map had been redrawn in 200 years. People who went into the Veilwood did not come out. Everyone in that room knew it. The council was choosing to look merciful while committing the same murder with cleaner hands. Seraphine felt something shift low in her chest, a heat she had never felt before, curling awake like a snake disturbed from decades of sleep. She had no name for it yet. She only knew that when Duke Vane's eyes finally met hers, something in her wanted him to be afraid. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "you should be more careful about which family you decide to erase." "Is that a threat, Lady Thorne?" "It's a fact. My grandmother used to say the Thorne bloodline slept, it didn't die. I never understood what she meant." Seraphine tilted her head, and for the first time that night she smiled, small, private, and utterly without fear. "I think I'm about to find out." The guards seized her arms. Queen Dahlia flinched at the movement, and for one fractured second Seraphine caught something in the older woman's face that was not triumph. It was terror. Pure, naked terror, aimed not at Seraphine's supposed crime, but at Seraphine herself. As if the Queen, too, had heard the old stories about sleeping bloodlines, and knew far better than anyone in that hall what waking one might cost. They marched her out through the grand doors, past nobles who would not look at her and servants who would not stop looking, past the marble hall where she had once danced at her presentation ball in a gown the color of dawn. Kalen finally rose from his seat as she passed the throne. For one moment their eyes met, and his lips shaped two words she was almost certain were "I'm sorry," though no sound came out at all. Sorry did not open chains. Sorry did not stop guards. Sorry was the coward's apology, offered only after the courage to prevent the crime had already failed, and Seraphine let it slide off her like rain off stone. At the palace gates, the herald read the final decree to a crowd that had gathered to watch a thorn fall, the way crowds always gather to watch anything burn. The gates groaned open onto a road that led north, toward the dark tree line already visible on the horizon, black and endless under a moon the color of old bone. "Any final words, Lady Thorne?" Duke Vane asked, close enough now that only she could hear him, his voice honey-smooth with satisfaction. Seraphine looked past him, one last time at the palace she had grown up in, at the throne she would never sit on, at the prince who could not save her, and the queen who feared her more than she should have any reason to. "Only one," she said. "Watch the horizon, Your Grace, I intend to be on it again." Then the guards shoved her forward. The chains fell away at the border stone as tradition demanded. Exiles were not permitted to carry Virelle steel beyond the wall, and Seraphine Thorne walked alone into the Veilwood, into the dark, into whatever waited for a bloodline that had slept for 400 years and was even now beginning to stir. Behind her the gates of Virelle closed with a sound like a verdict. Ahead of her something in the forest exhaled as though it had been waiting 19 years for exactly this moment to arrive. The Veilwood did not simply grow dark, it grew wrong. Seraphine had walked perhaps 2 miles past the border stone when she noticed the trees had begun to lean toward the path, not away from it, their bare branches curling overhead like fingers closing around a secret. The air tasted of copper and crushed pine. No birds sang. No insects hummed. The silence had weight, the particular silence of a room where someone is holding their breath. She had nothing. No cloak beyond the thin traveling dress they'd let her keep, no blade, no food, no fire. The kingdom had taken everything from her except the one thing they didn't know how to take, the strange heat that had woken in her chest the moment Duke Vane pronounced her sentence, and had not gone quiet since. By nightfall, cold enough to numb her fingers, she found a hollow beneath an ancient oak whose roots rose from the earth like the ribs of something long dead. She curled into it, arms wrapped around her knees, and for the first time since her mother's funeral, Seraphine Thorne allowed herself to cry not from fear of dying, but from the specific, quiet devastation of being betrayed by every person she had trusted to protect her. "You cry like your mother did," said a voice from the dark. Seraphine went rigid. She had no weapon, she had no plan. She had only the wild, useless instinct to press herself deeper into the hollow, as if bark could hide her from whatever had just spoken in a voice like wind moving through a cave. "Who's there?" A shape unfolded from the shadow between two trees. Not a man, not quite, though it wore a man's rough shape, skin the color of birch bark, eyes like twin embers banked low in a dying fire. Old. She understood that immediately in the way animals understand a predator's age by its stillness. This thing was old the way mountains were old. "I knew her," the creature said. "Aldrith Thorne, she came into this wood 40 years ago, half-starved and grieving much like you. I did not expect to see her daughter walk the same path." Seraphine's breath caught. "You knew my grandmother. I have known every Thorne who wandered far enough to find me, child, because your line in this forest share older business than your kingdom remembers." The creature crouched, unhurried, studying her with those Banktember eyes. "Do you know why they truly exiled you? Because a queen needed a scapegoat and a duke needed the Thorne lands. That is the reason on the surface. Beneath it lies an older one." The creature reached out one long finger, not touching her, simply pointing at the center of her chest, at the place where the strange heat still curled and waited. They exiled you because your blood is waking, and everyone who sits on that throne has been raised since childhood to fear the day a Starblood wakes inside their walls. Starblood? Seraphine repeated the word slowly, tasting its unfamiliar shape. What does that mean? It means 400 years ago, before Virelle was Virelle, this land was ruled not by kings, but by weavers, men and women who could call starlight down from the sky itself and shape it into shield or blade or ruin. Your bloodline descends from the last of them. The kingdom's first king did not defeat the weavers in open war, child. He poisoned their line, generation after generation, marrying weaver daughters into families that diluted the gift until it slept. Your mother's line was the last one strong enough that the sleep was never total. It only needed the right wound at the right depth to wake fully. Seraphine thought of the trial, of Duke Vane's careful, deliberate cruelty, of Queen Dahlia's genuine terror, the kind that made no sense for a woman who believed her poisoner had simply been caught. They knew, she whispered, they knew what I was before I did. They suspected. Exile was meant to solve two problems at once: remove the political threat of House Thorne, and send whatever slept in your blood somewhere it could never wake safely, deep in a forest that has swallowed every weaver bloodline that ever wandered in unprepared. The creature's ember eyes narrowed, something almost like approval flickering there. They made a grave miscalculation, though. This forest does not swallow weaver blood, child. It remembers it. It has been waiting 400 years for one of you to come home. The ground beneath Seraphine's palms grew warm, as though the ancient oak roots themselves were listening, drawing closer. Somewhere far off, deep in the black trees, she heard something that might have been a heartbeat, slow and vast, matching itself to the rhythm of her own pulse. What's happening to me? Her voice came out smaller than she wanted. Your ancestors called it the kindling. The first true wound a weaver suffers, a wound to the soul, not merely the body, is what breaks the seal placed on the bloodline. You were wounded tonight in the deepest way there is. Betrayed by your kingdom, your queen, and I suspect. The creature tilted its head, studying her with unsettling precision. Your prince as well. Seraphine's throat tightened. She said nothing, but she didn't need to. The creature saw the answer plainly enough in her face. Grief opens the door. What you do once you walk through it is entirely your own choosing. The creature rose to its full height, taller than she'd first realized, its birchbark skin catching what little moonlight filtered through the canopy. I am called Ashgrove. I have kept this wood and its buried memory since before Virelle had a name. I can teach you what your bloodline once knew, but only if you are prepared for what remembering will cost. What will it cost? Innocence, mostly. You cannot wield Starfire and remain the girl who cried in a hollow tonight. That girl believed the world was fair if she simply behaved well enough within it. The woman who walks out of this forest will know better. Ashgrove extended one long hand, palm up, an offering rather than a demand. So I ask you plainly, Seraphine Thorne, last of the sleeping bloodline, do you wish only to survive this forest, or do you wish to become what it has been waiting 400 years for you to become? Seraphine looked down at her own hands, soft, uncalloused, a noblewoman's hands that had never done harder work than embroidery and letters. She thought of Duke Vane's satisfied smile. She thought of Queen Dahlia's terror, which made far more sense now than it had an hour ago. She thought of Kaelin's silent, cowardly apology, offered too late to mean anything at all. She placed her palm in Ashgrove's without hesitation. Teach me everything, she said. I intend to give that throne room a very long overdue lesson in exactly what they exiled. Ashgrove's ember eyes brightened just slightly into something that might, on an older and stranger face, have been called a smile. Then we begin tonight, the ancient thing said, because 400 years is a very long debt, child, and the interest has grown considerable. Behind them. Deep in the black heart of the Veilwood, something vast and long buried stirred fully awake for the first time in 4 centuries. And far away in a palace that thought itself safe behind stone walls and silver chains, Queen Dahlia woke, gasping from a dream she could not remember. One hand pressed to a heart that would not stop racing until dawn. 3 months passed in the Veilwood, though Seraphine stopped counting days somewhere around the 2nd week, when time began to matter less than the ache in her muscles and the slow, patient burn of learning to hold Starfire without it devouring her from the inside. Ashgrove was not a gentle teacher. On her first attempt to call the light down, a simple thing he assured her the way a child's first steps are simple, the fire answered too fast and too strong. And it took him 3 days to heal the burns that spread from her palms to her elbows. She did not cry that time. She had already spent her allotment of tears on the first night, and something in her had decided, without her quite noticing the decision being made, that crying was a luxury the old Seraphine could afford and the new one could not. You are angry at the fire, Ashgrove observed on the ninth attempt, watching her cradle newly blistered hands. That is your error. Starfire does not answer to command, it answers to truth. You are trying to order it to behave the way your kingdom ordered you to behave for 19 years. It knows the difference between command and invitation, even if you do not yet. Then how do I invite it? Stop lying to yourself about what you actually want it for. Seraphine sat with that question longer than she wanted to. She had told herself in the palace in the chains, in her first sobbing night beneath the ancient oak, that she wanted justice. Justice was a clean word, a word that let her sleep at night, a word a good woman was allowed to want. But sitting alone in a forest that had shown her exactly how deep the rot in Virelle truly ran, Seraphine made herself admit silently to no one but the dark, that justice was not entirely what curled hot and hungry in her chest. She wanted Duke Vane on his knees. She wanted Queen Dahlia to understand, in her last waking moment of comfortable safety, exactly what fear the woman had spent 19 years failing to hide. She wanted Kaelin to watch everything he loved burn the way he had watched her walk to exile without lifting a single finger to stop it. She wanted, if she was honest, brutally, finally honest, revenge. The moment she stopped pretending otherwise, the fire came. It did not burn her this time. It poured from her palms in a controlled silver-gold stream, coiling around her wrist like a living bracelet, warm as sunlight and utterly obedient, because for the first time she had stopped fighting the truest, ugliest part of what she wanted and simply let it speak. There, Ashgrove said quietly, something like satisfaction warming his ancient voice. Now we can actually begin. The months that followed reshaped her entirely. Ashgrove taught her to call starlight into blade shapes sharp enough to part stone, to weave it into shields that could turn aside a mounted charge. To read the old runes carved into forgotten stones scattered throughout the forest. Remnants of the Weaver civilization, the first king of Virelle had spent his entire reign erasing from history. She learned that her family name, Thorne, was itself a corruption of an older word, Torneth, meaning unbroken in the dead Weaver tongue. She learned that Ashgrove was not simply a guardian of the forest, but the last surviving Weaver himself, transformed by a spell of preservation 3 centuries old, waiting, always waiting, for a bloodline strong enough to finish what his own generation had been slaughtered attempting. Why didn't you ever leave the forest? She asked him one evening, as she practiced weaving starfire into the shape of a rose, a small vanity she allowed herself after weeks of blades and shields. In 300 years, surely you could have found some way to challenge Virelle. Because I am the last of what I was, and the last of anything is too precious to spend on a fight it cannot win alone. Ashgrove watched the silver-gold rose bloom in her palm with something that might have been old grief. I have spent 3 centuries waiting for a bloodline capable of doing what I alone cannot. You are not simply my student, Seraphine. You are my only remaining hope, and the hope of every Weaver whose name Virelle erased from its history books to keep its throne comfortable. That weight should have terrified her. Instead, it settled into her chest like something finally fitting into a space that had been empty her entire life. It was in the 4th month, deep in a cavern beneath the forest's oldest grove, that Ashgrove showed her the truth that changed everything. The cavern walls were carved with murals so old their pigment had turned to ghost-pale outlines. But the shapes were unmistakable. A coronation, a Weaver queen crowned in starlight, kneeling before her stood rows of noble houses swearing fealty. And beside the queen, unmistakable even in faded pigment, stood a shield bearing the Thorne crest. Your bloodline did not simply survive the Weaver kingdom's fall, Ashgrove said quietly. Your bloodline ruled it. Before Virelle's first king murdered his way onto a stolen throne, House Thorne sat where House Vane's ancestors now scheme to sit. The exile the council pronounced against you was not simply cruelty, Seraphine. It was 400 years of fear, finally catching up to the one family whose blood remembered what the throne truly belongs to. Seraphine stared at the mural, at the ghost-pale queen who shared her family's crest, and felt something settle in her chest with the terrible, clarifying weight of a lock finally clicking open. They didn't exile a traitor, she said slowly. They exiled the rightful queen and called it justice so no one would ever ask the real question. Yes. Then when I return, Seraphine said, and her voice did not shake at all now, steady as the starfire humming quiet and patient beneath her skin, I am not simply coming for revenge against the people who wronged me. I am coming to take back what 400 years of lies stole from every Thorne who came before me. Ashgrove inclined his ancient head, something in his ember eyes that might, on a human face, have been pride, or perhaps simply relief 4 centuries in the making. Then it is time, he said, to teach you the final lesson, the one your ancestors called the Reckoning Weave, the one that has not been performed by a living Weaver in 400 years. Are you prepared, Seraphine Thorne, to learn what your bloodline was truly capable of before the fear of it burned an entire kingdom's history clean? Seraphine held out her palms, silver gold light already gathering there, patient and hungry and entirely finally her own to command. I was born prepared, she said. Virelle simply never bothered to ask. Far beyond the Veilwood's border, in a palace growing colder every night despite a dozen roaring fireplaces, Queen Dahlia had begun sleeping with a blade beneath her pillow, though she could never quite explain to her attendants what exactly she believed she needed protecting from. While Seraphine learned to burn without breaking in the deep Veilwood, Virelle's court had not stopped scheming in her absence. It had simply redirected its appetite toward new prey, the way courts always do when an old scandal grows stale. Duke Malric Vane had not become the most powerful man on the council by resting after a single victory. Within a month of Seraphine's exile, he had petitioned successfully to have the Thorne estates absorbed into crown land. Then, through a series of maneuvers so smooth even his allies admired their cruelty, had those lands quietly transferred into his own family's holdings under the guise of a stewardship grant. The Thorne name had been removed from every ledger, every map, every noble registry in the kingdom. Within 6 months, it was as though House Thorne had never existed at all. Prince Kaelin watched this happen from the edges of every council meeting, and said nothing, because he had learned, in the 3 months since Seraphine's exile, that saying something changed nothing except the target painted on his own back. "You look troubled, my prince," said Lady Exiled Fenmark one evening, finding him alone on the east balcony overlooking gardens gone brittle with early frost. Exiled was Kaelin's oldest friend, a captain's daughter who had grown up sparring with him in the training yards long before either of them understood what royal marriages required. She was also, Kaelin suspected, the only person left in the palace who still spoke to him honestly. "I keep thinking about the trial," he admitted, because lying to Exiled had never worked particularly well. "There was no vial found beneath her floorboards until the morning of her arrest. I checked the room myself 2 days before the accusation, looking for a missing brooch I'd gifted her. There was nothing hidden there." Exiled's expression sharpened. "You never told the council that. I never told anyone that." Kaelin's hands tightened on the balcony railing until his knuckles went white. "By the time I understood what was happening, the trial had already been scheduled. My mother was already terrified out of her senses, and Duke Vane had already secured enough council votes that a single witness statement from the prince would have accomplished nothing except getting me investigated alongside her. So you let her walk into exile instead." The accusation in Exiled's voice cut deeper than she likely intended, because it was precisely the accusation Kaelin had been leveling at himself, silently, every single night since the gates closed behind Seraphine's retreating back. "I told myself I would find proof," he said quietly. "I told myself once I found real evidence, I could petition for her recall, restore her name, undo what the council did in a single terrified night. I have spent 3 months searching, Exiled, and I have found nothing except more reasons to distrust my own mother." "What do you mean?" Kaelin glanced around the balcony, checking the shadows out of habit that had become instinct since the trial. "The night before Seraphine's arrest, my mother summoned Duke Vane to her chambers for a meeting that appears nowhere in the official schedule. Her lady's maid mentioned it to me by accident, then grew terrified when she realized what she'd said and refused to speak of it again. 2 days later, Seraphine stood accused of poisoning a woman who, as far as I can determine, was never actually poisoned at all. The royal physician's report lists my mother's symptoms as consistent with severe anxiety, not nightshade toxicity. No one thought to question that discrepancy publicly, because who questions the word of a queen claiming she was nearly murdered?" Exiled was quiet for a long moment, the frost-brittle gardens rustling faintly below them. "You believe your mother orchestrated the entire trial?" "I believe my mother is terrified of something, and I believe Duke Vane discovered exactly what that fear was, and used it to remove House Thorne from the board entirely while making it look like justice." Kaelin exhaled slowly, watching his breath fog in the cold air. "I simply cannot yet determine what that fear actually is." He would learn the answer 3 weeks later, and it would arrive in the worst possible way. It began with reports from the northern border villages, small, easily dismissed at first. A shepherd near Millhaven claimed he'd seen the tree line of the distant Veilwood glow gold at midnight, as though the forest itself had caught fire without burning. A merchant caravan traveling the border road reported their horses refusing to pass a certain stretch near the old Exile stone, rearing and screaming as though something unseen stood in the path. A border watchman swore he'd heard, carried faint on the wind at dawn, something that sounded unmistakably like a woman's voice, calling down starlight in a language no living scholar could translate. Duke Vane dismissed the reports publicly as border superstition, the kind that always spread through isolated villages during a hard winter. Privately, he summoned the head of the royal archives to his private study and demanded, in a voice his steward would later describe as unusually unsteady, every remaining record on something called the Weaver bloodline purges. He found far less than he wanted. 400 years of careful, deliberate historical erasure had done its work well, but not perfectly. Buried in a genealogical record too old and too obscure for anyone to have thought worth destroying, he found a single line that made his blood run cold. House Thorne, formerly Torneth, last confirmed Weaver-descended noble line, presumed fully diluted circa the 2nd Virelle century. Presumed, not confirmed. Duke Vane sat alone in his private study long after midnight, staring at that single damning word, and understood with the particular clarity that only genuine fear provides, that he had not simply exiled a political rival 3 months ago. He had exiled a threat his ancestors had spent 400 years and untold cruelty trying to permanently extinguish, and he had sent her directly into the one forest in the entire kingdom capable of waking whatever remained sleeping in her blood. "Send word to the border garrison," he told his steward, voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Double the watch along the entire Veilwood boundary, and find me every remaining record we have on Weaver-killing steel. If what I fear is true, we may need it sooner than any of us are prepared for." 300 miles north in a cavern, beneath the forest's oldest grove, Seraphine Thorne stood before a mural of a ghost-pale queen wearing her own family's crest and felt. Without yet understanding why the first true stirrings of the reckoning that was coming for Virelle far sooner than its council had dared to imagine. The attack came on a night when Seraphine least expected it, which Ashgrove later informed her was precisely the point. Enemies capable of true cruelty rarely announced themselves with courtesy. She had ventured to the forest's eastern edge alone, against Ashgrove's cautious advice, drawn by curiosity toward the border stone where her chains had been struck away 5 months prior. She told herself she simply wanted to see it again, to measure how far she'd traveled from the frightened, weeping girl who'd first crossed that line. In truth, some smaller, more honest part of her wanted to stand at the boundary of her old life and confirm, beyond any doubt, that she was no longer the same woman the kingdom had discarded. She found 6 armed men waiting instead. "Well," said their leader, a broad-shouldered mercenary with a scar bisecting one eyebrow, stepping out from behind the border stone with a crossbow already leveled at her chest. "Duke Vane said we might find something interesting out here if we watched long enough. Didn't expect it'd be quite this pretty." "You're trespassing on exiled ground," Seraphine said, keeping her voice level despite the sudden cold spike of adrenaline. "The law forbids armed parties within a mile of the border stone. Funny thing about laws, sweetheart. They only matter to the people who still believe the men enforcing them care." The mercenary's grin widened, cruel and confident. "Duke's paying good coin for proof House Thorne's little exile survived the winter, and better coin still if we bring back proof of what exactly's been lighting up these woods at midnight. Now, you can come along peaceful-like, or we can make this the hard way. Either way ends the same. 5 months ago, this moment would have ended in Seraphine's death, or worse. 5 months ago, she had been a noblewoman with soft hands and a talent for embroidery, utterly unequipped to face 6 armed men in a darkening forest. She was not that woman anymore. "You should have brought more men," Seraphine said quietly, and let the Starfarer answer finally fully, without hesitation or fear of the cost. It poured from her palms in twin streams of silver-gold light, coalescing into blades sharper than any forged steel, and she moved through the mercenaries' formation with a speed that Ashgrove's 5 months of brutal, patient training had carved into her muscles like a second instinct. The crossbow bolt aimed at her chest never fired. She was already inside the leader's guard before his finger tightened, Starfire blade pressed flat and burning against his throat before he'd fully registered she had moved at all. "Tell Duke Vane," she said, voice cold and perfectly steady, "that the exile he sentenced sends her regards and a warning. The next men he sends into this forest will not be permitted to leave it." She did not kill him. She told herself in the moment that mercy was the choice of a stronger woman than revenge alone could make her. In truth, some deeper strategic instinct, the one Ashgrove had spent months sharpening alongside her Starfire, understood that a living witness carrying genuine terror back to Virelle's court would accomplish far more than 5 more corpses ever could. The remaining mercenaries fled into the dark, dragging their humiliated leader with them, and Seraphine stood alone at the border stone, chest heaving, Starfire still humming warm beneath her skin, and felt something she had not expected to feel at all. Not triumph, not satisfaction, grief. Because standing there, victorious and untouched, she understood with sudden, aching clarity that the girl who had cried beneath the ancient oak 5 months ago was well and truly gone, replaced by a woman capable of holding a blade to a man's throat without her hand shaking even slightly. She had wanted this power. She had asked Ashgrove to teach her, had chosen this path with open eyes and full understanding of its cost. Understanding a cost and actually paying it, she was learning, were two very different experiences entirely. "You did well," Ashgrove said, appearing silently at her shoulder as he so often did, ember eyes studying her with something gentler than she expected. "And you grieve appropriately, which tells me the fire has not yet consumed everything gentle left in you. That is important, Seraphine. A weaver who loses all grief loses, eventually, everything worth fighting for in the first place. It would be easier," she admitted quietly, "if I simply stopped feeling anything at all. Easier, yes, also considerably more dangerous." Ashgrove's ancient voice carried a weight she hadn't heard from him before, something almost like personal memory. "I watched 3 of my fellow weavers 400 years ago choose that path when the purges began. They stopped grieving what the killing cost them, believing it made them stronger, more effective, more capable of winning the fight. Do you know what became of them? What? They became precisely the monsters Virel's first king told his people all weavers secretly were. Their cruelty gave his lies the proof they needed. Their fall justified 400 years of persecution against everyone who came after them." Ashgrove turned to face her fully, ember eyes burning with quiet intensity. "You are not simply fighting to reclaim a stolen throne, Seraphine. You are fighting to prove that power like yours does not have to become what Virelle has spent 4 centuries insisting it must. Keep your grief. It is not weakness. It is the only thing standing between you and becoming exactly what your enemies need you to become, to justify everything they've already done to your bloodline." Seraphine absorbed that in silence, watching the last traces of starfire fade from her hands back into ordinary skin, ordinary blood, ordinary bone that nonetheless carried something extraordinary sleeping beneath its surface. "Duke Vane knows now," she said finally. "Whatever fragile secrecy I had is gone. He'll prepare for what's coming." "Yes, good," Seraphine said, and meant it, some cold and patient part of her already calculating the shape of what came next. "Let him prepare. Let him spend every remaining night wondering exactly how much of his 400-year lie is about to collapse, and precisely when the woman he threw away is finally coming home to collect it. Far to the south in a border garrison, receiving frantic new orders from the capital. A terrified mercenary captain sat gripping a cup of untouched wine, describing to increasingly pale-faced officers exactly what 6 armed men had encountered at the Veilwood's eastern edge, and precisely how quickly and how completely. All 6 of them had understood that the woman in that forest was no longer anyone's helpless victim at all. Kalen learned about the border stone incident 4 days after it happened, filtered through 3 layers of frightened whispers before it reached him in any coherent form, and the moment he understood its true shape, something in him that had been quietly suffocating for 5 months finally, desperately drew breath. She was alive, not simply alive, transformed, powerful enough to disarm 6 armed mercenaries without visible effort. Powerful enough that Duke Vane had spent 4 days in what his steward described as a state approaching genuine panic. Kalen found himself, for the first time since the trial, uncertain whether the emotion flooding through him was relief or terror. Perhaps, he admitted privately, it was both in equal, complicated measure. "You cannot go north," Exiled told him bluntly, finding him in the map room past midnight, tracing the Veilwood's border with one finger as though proximity to parchment might somehow bring him closer to answers. "If Duke Vane learns the Crown Prince attempted contact with an exiled weaver, it will not simply end your standing at court, Kalen. It will end your life, and quite possibly your mother's as well, given how thoroughly the Council has convinced itself that House Thorne represents an existential threat. I owe her the truth, Exiled. I owe her an explanation for why I stood silent while they exiled her for a crime I already suspected she hadn't committed." "You owe her nothing that requires you to die delivering it," Exiled said, not unkindly, but with the particular firmness of someone who had watched Kalen make reckless decisions from horseback since they were both children. "If she is truly what the reports suggest, she does not need your protection anymore, Kalen. What she may need eventually is an ally inside these walls who still has the standing to matter when she finally decides to walk back through the gates. You cannot be that ally from a shallow grave outside the Veilwood." The logic was sound. Kalen hated how sound it was. "Then what would you have me do instead? What you should have done 5 months ago." Exiled crossed the room, lowering her voice despite the empty chamber, old habits from a court where walls genuinely did have ears. Find the truth about what actually happened the night your mother claimed poisoning. Find who placed that vial beneath Seraphine's floorboards. Build a case strong enough that when she does return, there is a path back to legitimacy waiting for her that doesn't require burning the entire kingdom down to achieve it. Kaelin considered this, turning the idea over with the same careful attention he'd once given battle strategy lessons from the Royal War Master. You think she intends to burn it down? I think a woman who can disarm 6 mercenaries without drawing blood, then send them home alive specifically to spread fear rather than simply killing them for efficiency, is a woman thinking several steps ahead of pure vengeance. Exiled's expression sharpened with something like grudging respect. I think Seraphine Thorne is building towards something considerably larger than personal revenge, Kaelin, and I think when she arrives, this kingdom will need people inside it capable of choosing which side of that reckoning they stand on before the choice is made for them. Kaelin spent the following 2 weeks doing precisely what Exiled suggested, moving through the palace with the quiet, patient persistence of a man finally committed to a purpose worth the risk. He questioned kitchen staff about the night of the alleged poisoning, cross-referencing schedules and access logs until a pattern emerged that made his stomach turn. The vial found beneath Seraphine's floorboards had been logged into the royal apothecary's inventory 2 days before her arrest, then quietly removed by a steward under Duke Vayne's direct household, not the Queen's. He found the royal physician's original, unedited report, the one submitted before Duke Vayne's allies had clarified its language for the trial record, and confirmed what he'd already suspected. His mother's symptoms had never matched nightshade poisoning at all. They matched instead the particular physical signature of a woman experiencing genuine, uncontrollable panic. Panic over what, though, remained maddeningly out of reach, until Kaelin finally cornered his mother alone in her private chapel, candles guttering low around them both, and asked her directly, "Mother, what are you actually afraid of?" Queen Dahlia's hands trembled around the prayer beads she'd been working through for the better part of an hour. For a long moment, Kaelin thought she would simply refuse to answer, retreat into the practice deflection she'd perfected across 2 decades of ruling a kingdom built on secrets older than her own reign. Instead, to his genuine shock, she began to weep. "I was 17, she said quietly, "the year my own mother told me the truth every reigning queen of Virelle learns before her coronation and swears never to repeat. Our throne was not won in honest war, Kaelin. It was stolen from a Weaver dynasty through poison, betrayal, and 400 years of careful, deliberate lies designed to erase an entire bloodline from history before that bloodline could ever wake to reclaim what was taken from them." Kaelin felt something cold settle in his chest. House Thorne. House Thorneth originally. Dahlia's voice cracked on the old, forbidden name. "I did not orchestrate Seraphine's exile out of political convenience, Kaelin. I did it out of pure terror. The moment my spies confirmed rumors that her mother had begun researching the family's true genealogy before her sudden death. I convinced myself that removing Seraphine before her bloodline could fully wake was the only way to protect our throne, our family, everything 400 years of careful lies had built. Duke Vayne simply provided the convenient method." She looked up at her son, eyes red-rimmed and finally, terribly honest. "I built the trial on falsehood because I was terrified of a truth I have known since I was 17 years old. Our entire reign, Kaelin, is built on a crime committed against a bloodline we should never have been strong enough to erase in the first place." Kaelin stood in the guttering candlelight of his mother's private chapel, staring at a woman he had spent his entire life believing simply ruled, never once suspecting she had spent that same lifetime drowning quietly beneath an inherited, unbearable guilt. "She's coming back," he said finally. "You understand that, don't you? Whatever peace you hoped exile would buy this family, it's already lost." "I know," Queen Dahlia whispered, pressing her prayer beads against her forehead as though the old, worn wood could somehow absorb the weight of what she'd finally confessed. "I have known since the border reports began 3 weeks ago. I am simply no longer certain, my son, whether I am praying for protection from her return or absolution for ever having caused it." 6 months into her exile, Seraphine stood in the cavern of ghost-pale murals and asked Ashgrove the question she had been circling for weeks without daring to speak aloud. "You said I am not the only piece required for the reckoning weave. What else does it need?" Ashgrove's expression, insofar as his ancient features could shift into anything resembling human emotion, grew unusually careful. "It requires an army, Seraphine. Not a mercenary force purchased with gold, but something rarer, living descendants of the noble houses your ancestors once ruled. Houses whose bloodlines carry, Even now, faint echoes of the old fealty oath sworn to House Thorne 4 centuries ago. The weave cannot simply crown you queen through force alone. Force alone would make you no different than the king who stole this throne in the first place. It requires willing recognition, freely offered by bloodlines old enough to remember, however faintly, what they once swore. And how exactly am I meant to find willing descendants of a dynasty the kingdom spent 400 years erasing? The same way you found me, Ashgrove said, by going where the forgotten things still wait to be remembered. The following weeks took Seraphine beyond the Veilwood's borders for the first time since her exile, moving carefully through territory where Duke Vane's mercenaries now patrolled with genuine fear, rather than idle curiosity, tracing Ashgrove's guidance towards scattered pockets of the kingdom, where old bloodlines had settled generations ago. Their noble titles stripped or diminished across centuries of Virel's careful consolidation of power. She found her first ally in a village called Hollowmere, where an elderly blacksmith named Corvin Ashdown kept hidden beneath his forge floor a sword his family had passed down for 11 generations. Its blade inscribed with runes he'd never been able to read, but had never once considered destroying despite a great-grandfather's warning that owning it marked the family as dangerous should the wrong eyes ever notice. Weaver steel, Ashgrove confirmed, examining the blade with something like reverent recognition. Forged for House Ashdown's ancestor, who served as sword master to the last Thorneth queen. This family swore an oath of unbroken service 400 years ago, Corvin, and though you were never taught its meaning, some part of your blood has clearly never forgotten it. Corvin Ashdown, 63 years old with hands still strong from decades at the forge, looked between the ancient sword and the young woman Ashgrove had brought to his door, and made a decision his ancestors had waited 4 centuries for someone to finally ask him to make. My grandson trains at the garrison, he said slowly. He's a good soldier, loyal to the crown as he's been raised to be. But he's also spent his whole life feeling like something's missing from the stories his own family tells about itself. Like we're all reciting half a history and pretending it's whole. He wrapped the ancient blade carefully back in its cloth, then held it out to Seraphine with both hands, the gesture of a man offering something far heavier than steel. If you're truly what this old thing claims you are, my lady, then I imagine my family's owed you a debt 11 generations overdue. Tell me where to bring my sword and my grandson besides, and we'll pay it. It was Seraphine would later realize. The first of many such moments. Old bloodlines scattered across forgotten villages carrying fragments of oaths and heirlooms, and half-remembered family stories that had never quite made sense, until a woman with silver-gold fire in her palms arrived to explain finally precisely what those fragments meant. House Fenmark, whose captain's daughter Exiled had grown up entirely unaware her family once held a weaver oath of protection, sent quiet word through discreet channels that her father's old garrison contacts could be trusted should the time come. House Vantes. The same family whose daughter had once whispered cruel commentary in the gallery during Seraphine's trial, produced a younger cousin who arrived at the Veilwood's border alone, having spent months secretly researching her own family's suppressed genealogy after witnessing her cousin's casual cruelty during the trial and feeling, for the first time, deeply ashamed of what her house had become by the 8th month. Seraphine commanded not an army in the traditional sense, not yet enough soldiers to meet Virel's standing forces in open battle, but something Ashgrove insisted was considerably more valuable. A growing network of old bloodlines quietly reawakening to oaths they'd forgotten they carried. Each one another crack spreading through the foundation of Duke Vane's confident 400-year-old lie. Word will reach Virelle soon, Ashgrove warned her, as she stood before her growing council of allies in a clearing lit gold by an unusually bright autumn moon. Duke Vane is not a fool. He will notice noble families growing quietly restless, will eventually connect the pattern to you, and when he does, he will not hesitate to strike first, with whatever force he believes necessary to prevent what he now clearly understands is coming. Let him strike first, Seraphine said, watching Corvin Ashdown's grandson spar with 2 other newly arrived allies beneath the moonlight, watching Exiled's garrison contacts drill formations borrowed from old Weaver battle texts Ashgrove had preserved for 4 centuries. Every soldier he sends against us who returns home alive, spreading true accounts of what they witnessed, does more damage to his authority than any battle I could win outright. I am not simply building an army, Ashgrove. I am building proof, undeniable and growing by the day, that everything Virel's council has told this kingdom about House Thorne, about the Weavers, about the very foundation of their stolen throne, has been a lie sustained through nothing but fear and violence for 400 years. Ashgrove studied her in the moonlight, something in his ancient ember eyes that might, on a human face, have been the particular pride of a teacher watching a student finally surpass every lesson he'd been capable of offering. "Your grandmother once told me something similar," he said quietly, "the year she first wandered into this forest, grieving and furious in equal measure. She did not live long enough to see it through, Seraphine. Illness took her before the weave could be completed, and I confess I had begun to fear the bloodline itself might simply run out of time before it ran out of strength." "It hasn't," Seraphine said, watching starfhair curl warm and steady around her wrist in the cold autumn air. "I don't intend to run out of either." Far south in a war room lit by nervous candlelight, Duke Vane stood over a map marked with a dozen new red pins, noble houses whose loyalty had begun inexplicably to waver, and understood with the particular dread of a man finally grasping the true size of a threat he'd badly underestimated. That whatever was gathering in the Veilwood had grown considerably larger than a single vengeful exile. The betrayal, when it came, arrived exactly as Ashgrove had warned her it might, not from an enemy she expected, but from somewhere close enough to cut deeper than any mercenary blade ever could. It was Aloan Vantes, the young cousin who had arrived alone at the Veilwood's border months earlier, ashamed of her family's cruelty and desperate to make amends, who Seraphine had trusted enough to send north with a small group of allies to scout the movement of Duke Vane's forces along the border road. She had not returned when expected. When she finally did, 3 days late and pale with something Seraphine initially mistook for exhaustion, the truth emerged with brutal, quiet clarity during a private conversation in Ashgrove's cavern. "They took my mother," Aloan said, voice breaking on every second word. "Duke Vane's men seized her from our estate 4 days ago, held her in the capital dungeons, and sent word that she'd be executed for treason within the week unless I provided detailed information about your numbers, your allies, your planned movements. I'm sorry, Seraphine, I'm so sorry. I told them what they wanted to know, I didn't have a choice." Seraphine felt something cold settle beneath her ribs, the particular ache of watching someone she'd genuinely come to trust confess to exactly the kind of desperate, understandable weakness that could unravel 8 months of careful, painstaking work. "How much did you tell them?" "Everything I knew, your numbers roughly. The location of the Eastern training grounds, the fact that House Ashton and House Fenmark have both openly committed to your cause." Aloan would not meet her eyes, shame radiating off her invisible waves. "I know what this means. I know I've likely doomed everyone here. I only ask that you let me try to help fix what I've broken before whatever punishment I've earned." Ashgrove, silent throughout the confession, finally spoke, his ancient voice carrying none of the fury Seraphine half expected. "Duke Vane now knows the approximate strength and location of your forces. He will move quickly, likely within days, believing speed his best remaining advantage before your numbers grow beyond his capacity to counter. Then we have days to prepare for an attack we now know is coming," Seraphine said slowly, an idea beginning to take shape with the particular cold clarity that had become, over 8 months of hard-won transformation, entirely her own. She turned to Aloan, studying the younger woman's genuine, devastated guilt. "You didn't betray us out of malice. You made an impossible choice under threat to someone you love, and I understand that choice better than perhaps anyone alive, because I have spent 8 months learning exactly what desperate people are capable of when everything they love is threatened. You're not going to punish me." "I'm going to use you," Seraphine said, "the same way Duke Vane tried to use you against me. He believes he now holds the advantage of surprise. He does not yet know that we know he knows." A slow, dangerous smile crossed her face, one that carried nothing of the frightened girl who'd first crossed the Veilwood's border 8 months earlier. "Aloan, I need you to send Duke Vane exactly the information he expects, confirming his belief that his attack will catch us unprepared. Everything you tell him from this point forward will be precisely what I choose to let him know." The plan that followed occupied every waking hour of the following 4 days. Ashgrove's centuries of accumulated battle knowledge combined with Seraphine's own quickly sharpening strategic mind, reshaping what should have been a devastating betrayal into the single greatest advantage they'd yet possessed. Duke Vane's forces, Aloan's careful, controlled misinformation confirmed, would strike at dawn on the 5th day, moving through the eastern training grounds Aloan had previously honestly disclosed. What Duke Vane did not know could not know was that Seraphine had already relocated her true forces to the forest's deep interior 3 days prior, leaving only a carefully staged decoy camp at the eastern grounds. Tended by a handful of volunteers and reinforced with defensive Starfhair wards, Ashgrove had spent 3 centuries perfecting and never once had cause to use. Duke Vane's forces struck at dawn exactly as predicted, 300 armed soldiers under the command of his most trusted captain, expecting to overwhelm a scattered, unprepared rebel encampment before it could grow into a genuine threat to Virel's stability. They found instead a forest that fought back on its own terms. The defensive wards Ashgrove had woven into the ancient trees themselves activated the moment Duke Vane's forces crossed the boundary, disorienting formations, turning familiar paths into confusing loops that returned soldiers to their own starting positions. Filling the air with a low ancient hum that several soldiers later swore had made their weapons feel impossibly heavy in their hands. By the time the confused, thoroughly demoralized force finally located the decoy camp, they found it entirely empty, save for a single message burned in silver-gold light into the largest tree at the camp center, visible for miles in every direction. Your Duke sent you to die for a life 400 years old. Go home. Tell him the exile sends her thanks for confirming exactly how far he's willing to go and how badly he's already lost. Duke Vane's captain returned to the capital with his entire force intact but thoroughly publicly humiliated, an outcome Seraphine had calculated with deliberate precision. A slaughtered force would have created martyrs and justified further escalation. A humiliated, unharmed force returning with impossible stories of a forest that fought back with ancient magic created something considerably more dangerous to Duke Vane's authority. Doubt spreading through his own ranks like wildfire, soldiers whispering among themselves about whether their Duke was truly fighting a simple exiled criminal, or something considerably larger and older than any of them had been told. Eloan's mother, meanwhile, remained in the capital dungeons, and it was this piece of unfinished business that occupied Seraphine's thoughts as she watched the humiliated retreat from a hidden vantage point deep in the trees. "We've won this battle," she told Ashgrove quietly, "but Eloan's mother remains a hostage, and Duke Vane will not simply release her out of goodwill after tonight's humiliation. If anything, he'll use her as leverage more desperately now, having lost every other advantage he believed he held." "Then it seems," Ashgrove said, ember eyes glinting with something that might have been anticipation, "that the time has finally come to bring this reckoning to Virel's gates directly, rather than continuing to wait for Virel to bring the fight here." Seraphine watched the last of Duke Vane's retreating forces disappear over the horizon, starfire curling warm and steady beneath her skin, and felt, for the first time since her exile began, the true shape of what came next settling into focus with terrible, satisfying clarity. "Gather everyone," she said. "It's time we discussed exactly how a Tornith Queen intends to walk back through Virel's gates." The army that marched south from the Veilwood 11 months after Seraphine Thorne's exile was not the force Duke Vane had spent months preparing to face. It numbered perhaps 400 souls in total, a fraction of Virel's standing military, but every one of them carried Weaver-descended blood freshly reawakened, ancient oaths finally honored after 4 centuries of forgetting, and a conviction that Duke Vane's mercenary forces, however numerous, simply could not match. Word of the humiliated retreat from the Veilwood had spread through the kingdom faster than any official announcement could contain it, reshaping public sentiment in ways Duke Vane's council had utterly failed to anticipate. Villages along the border road, rather than fleeing the approaching force, began quietly providing food shelter. And information drawn by whispered stories of a woman wronged by a corrupt council wielding power the kingdom's oldest bloodlines were only now beginning to remember belonged rightfully to a queen stolen from them 400 years ago. Kaelin learned of the army's approach 3 days before it reached Virel's outer villages, the information arriving through Exilved's careful network of garrison. Contacts, several of whom he was quietly relieved to discover, had already begun quietly refusing direct orders to fortify the capital's defenses against what they privately called, among themselves, the rightful queen's return. "You need to decide, and quickly," Exiled told him, finding him once more in the map room, this time with the weight of genuine, imminent choice pressing down on every word. "Duke Vane intends to marshal every remaining loyal soldier for a final defense of the palace itself. Your mother has locked herself in her chambers and refuses to speak with anyone. And you, Kaelin, still have a chance to choose which side of this reckoning history remembers you standing on, but that window is closing faster than either of us would like. I'm not choosing a side, Exiled. I'm choosing to fix what my family broke." Kaelin's voice carried a certainty that surprised even himself, 11 months of quiet investigation and mounting guilt finally crystallizing into genuine resolve. "Gather every guard captain who trusts you. Tell them the Crown Prince intends to open the palace gates himself when Seraphine Thorne's forces arrive, and any soldier unwilling to raise a blade against their rightful queen is welcome to stand beside me instead." The final confrontation, when it came 2 days later, unfolded with none of the prolonged, bloody siege Duke Vane had spent months preparing his forces to withstand. Seraphine arrived at Virel's gates at dawn exactly as she'd promised Duke Vane 11 months earlier. Standing at the head of her small but utterly resolute army, Starfire humming steady and controlled beneath her skin, Ashgrove at her side, for the first time in 3 centuries, stepping beyond the Veilwood's border he had guarded so faithfully. Duke Vane's remaining forces, gathered along the capital's outer walls, found themselves facing a choice their duke had never adequately prepared them to make. Word had spread too thoroughly, too completely, through every rank and garrison, of a woman betrayed by lies, wielding ancient power the kingdom itself had been built to erase, marching not to slaughter a kingdom but to reclaim a throne stolen from her bloodline 4 centuries ago. The gates opened before Seraphine ever needed to test whether her Starfire could breach them. Kalen stood at the threshold himself, having spent the previous night convincing enough guard captains of his sincerity to guarantee the gesture would not simply end in his own execution. Watching the woman he'd failed to protect 11 months earlier approach at the head of an army that should by every reasonable measure have been impossible for her to raise. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said quietly, as she drew close enough to hear him over the murmuring crowd gathering along the capital's main thoroughfare. "I failed you when it mattered most, Seraphine, and no explanation I could offer changes that fundamental truth. I'm opening these gates because it's the first genuinely right thing I've managed to do since your trial, not because I believe it earns me anything from you in return." Seraphine studied him for a long silent moment, Starfire still curling patient and watchful around her wrists. 11 months of transformation standing visible between the frightened girl who'd once trusted this man's silent, cowardly apology and the woman who now stood capable of taking this entire kingdom by force if she chose to. "You're right," she said finally. "It doesn't earn you forgiveness. But it's a beginning, Kalen, and I find I'm no longer interested in burning down everything simply because burning would feel satisfying in the moment. I have a considerably larger reckoning to attend to first." She walked past him through the open gates, her small army following in disciplined, silent formation, and made her way directly toward the palace's grand hall, where Duke Vane, having exhausted every remaining option, waited with the particular desperate courage of a man who understood he had already lost, but refused to abandon the stage before the final verdict was formally spoken. "Lady Thorne," he said, voice carrying a brittle, performative confidence that fooled absolutely no one in the gathering crowd. "Or should I say Lady Torneth? It seems the old records were not so thoroughly erased as my ancestors believed." "No," Seraphine agreed, climbing the same marble dais where she had once stood in silver chains 11 months earlier. "They were not. 400 years of careful lies, Duke Vane, and it took exactly one honest exile to unravel every thread of it." "And what exactly do you intend now? Slaughter the council that wronged you, burn the throne room your ancestors supposedly built?" Vane's voice cracked with barely restrained panic beneath its practiced composure. "Tell this kingdom precisely what kind of queen you intend to be, Seraphine, before they decide whether your return represents justice or simply a different flavor of tyranny." Seraphine turned to face the gathered crowd, nobles and commoners alike. Guards who had chosen not to raise their blades against her servants, who had once refused to meet her eyes as she walked to exile, all watching now, with the particular breathless silence of people witnessing history reshape itself in real time. "I intend," she said, her voice carrying clear and steady across the entire hall, "to give this kingdom the one thing 400 years of stolen thrones and buried lies never actually offered it. The truth spoken plainly, followed by whatever justice that truth demands, delivered not through slaughter, but through the same law this council once twisted to destroy me. The trial of Duke Malric Vane and the formal reckoning of House Thorne's stolen legacy. Unfolded across 3 days in the same throne room where Seraphine had once stood condemned, though this time every seat in the gallery was filled. And this time, for the first time in 400 years, the truth was permitted to speak without interference. Aloin Vanti's mother, freed from the capital dungeons within hours of the palace gates opening, provided testimony confirming Duke Vane's direct orders regarding her imprisonment, used explicitly as leverage to extract intelligence against Seraphine's forces. Corvin Ashdown, standing beside his grandson in ceremonial armor bearing House Ashdown's rediscovered crest, presented 11 generations of family sword oaths as physical evidence of House Thorne's genuine historical legitimacy. Isolde Fenmark, her own family's suppressed Weaver oath finally spoken aloud in open court, testified to the systematic falsification of evidence used against Seraphine during her original trial. Queen Dahlia, pale but resolute, chose to testify last, standing before the full assembled court to confess in her own words. The terror that had driven her to orchestrate Seraphine's original exile, not out of political calculation, but out of a lifetime spent inheriting guilt over a crown built on erasure. Unable to imagine any solution beyond continuing the same cycle of fear that had sustained her family's reign for 4 centuries. "I was wrong," she said, voice breaking but steady. "Not simply in the trial I orchestrated against you, Seraphine, but in believing my entire life that protecting this throne required continuing a lie my ancestors began through violence. I never had the courage to name honestly, until watching you prove beyond any doubt that the truth was always stronger than the fear we built to hide it." Duke Vane offered every opportunity across 3 days to explain, justify, or mitigate his actions, chose instead to insist, with increasingly desperate conviction, that everything he'd done had been necessary to protect Virel's stability from a threat his own ancestors had correctly identified 4 centuries ago. "You would have this kingdom governed by magic no living person besides yourself and your ancient creature truly understands," he said, gesturing toward Ashgrove, who stood silent and watchful at Seraphine's side throughout the proceedings. "I did what 400 years of Virel's rulers understood was necessary. I protected this throne from a power that threatens everything stable governance requires." "You didn't protect this throne, Duke Vane," Seraphine said quietly, and something in her voice carried across the silent hall with the particular weight of absolute, unshakable certainty. "You protected your own family's stolen position on it, using fear and lies and the deaths of anyone inconvenient enough to threaten your comfort. That is not governance. That is precisely the tyranny you accuse me of intending, except you have simply practiced it quietly enough, for long enough, that this kingdom forgot to recognize it for what it always was." The council's verdict, delivered on the 3rd day by judges Seraphine had insisted be drawn from across the kingdom's provinces, rather than hand-picked from Duke Vane's own allies, found him guilty of treason, judicial fraud, and the attempted murder of Seraphine Thorne through the deliberate falsification of evidence used to secure her original unjust exile. His sentence, unlike the mercy briefly extended to Seraphine 11 months earlier, carried no similar leniency. But it was Seraphine herself, standing once more on the marble dais, who ultimately determined the shape justice would finally take. "I have spent 11 months, she told the assembled court, "learning exactly what it costs to become powerful enough to reclaim what was stolen from my bloodline. I could execute you here, Duke Vane, exactly as you once intended for me, and I suspect a significant portion of this kingdom would consider that outcome entirely fair, given everything your family's ambitions have cost mine across 4 centuries. She paused, watching him brace for the verdict he clearly expected. "But I did not spend 11 months learning to wield Starfire simply to become a different flavor of the same cruelty that built this throne in the first place. You will not die today, Duke Vane. You will instead spend the remainder of your life stripped of title, land, and name, laboring in service to the very border villages your ambitions spent decades neglecting, until you understand in ways your comfortable ambitions never permitted you to learn. Exactly what the people beneath your stolen power actually needed from you all along." The sentence, considerably harsher in its own quiet way than the swift mercy of execution, settled over the gathered court with the particular weight of a justice built on something more enduring than simple vengeance. In the months that followed Seraphine Thorne's coronation, restored House Thorne's true name and legacy to Virel's history. The ancient murals Ashgrove had preserved for 4 centuries, finally brought into the capital's own archives, taught openly to a new generation who would grow up understanding, for the first time in 400 years, the true and complete history of the kingdom they inherited. Queen Dahlia, choosing exile of her own volition rather than continued rule she no longer believed she deserved, retreated to a quiet estate in the northern provinces. Her final act as queen, a formal, public transfer of legitimate authority to the bloodline her own ancestors had once stolen it from. Kaelin remained at court not as consort or prince, but as something Seraphine herself insisted on defining carefully. An advisor whose 11 months of quiet investigation had helped unravel the very lies that once condemned her, earning back slowly, and without any guarantee of ultimate reconciliation. The kind of trust that could not simply be granted through a single act of opened gates, but might, given enough honest time, eventually be rebuilt into something neither of them yet dared to name. Ashgrove remained beside the new queen as well, no longer bound solely to the Veilwood's ancient borders, the last living weaver finally free to see the kingdom he'd spent 3 centuries in patient, hopeful exile working to eventually reclaim. On the evening of her formal coronation, Seraphine stood once more at the same palace gates where guards had once marched her toward exile in chains of pure silver, and looked out at a kingdom, finally beginning to understand the true weight and cost of the throne it had built on 4 centuries of buried lies. They exiled a frightened girl believing they had permanently silenced a threat to their comfortable, stolen power. She said quietly to Ashgrove, starfire curling warm and steady beneath her skin, no longer a wild, unpredictable force but something fully, finally her own to command with complete and settled purpose. They forgot in their arrogance that some bloodlines do not simply break beneath betrayal. Some of us learn, in the darkest and most unforgiving forests imaginable, exactly how to burn brighter than the lies that tried to bury us. Ashgrove inclined his ancient head, something in his ember eyes that had waited 400 patient years finally, fully at peace. 400 years of silence, he said softly, and it took exactly one unbroken exile to finally teach an entire kingdom how loudly the truth could speak, once someone was brave enough to finally let it burn.